known as where's my phone?
Good morning, everyone. It's 10 a.m., so we are going to get started. We are going to try to keep this forum to about an hour this morning because a lot of you have places to go and things to do, including our panelists. I'm Janice Zittelman, president of our local League of Women Voters, Hill Country, and I really want to thank you for coming today to hear our speakers and learn about these proposed constitutional amendments that will be on the ballot in the coming weeks. Perhaps you wonder why we volunteer and do this. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization, and our mission is to encourage informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. The League is nonpartisan, and this means, as an organization, the League does not support any political party or candidate. While members are encouraged to become informed and involved in local and national politics, the only person who speaks for a local league as an organization is the president. And I hope each of you have gotten a voter's guide this morning. You will note in there's stated pros and cons, but there's no recommendation on how you should vote. That's up to the individual. But the guide is one way we use to educate voters. I also encourage you, I think you've already heard this, if you have a place or will be seeing members of a group that would be interested in using the voter's guide, take some with you because we do want it out in the community. Some housekeeping issues: restrooms are down the hall. If you go out those doors, go to your right. Please silence your cell phones. Do not record or photograph. The print media may audio record and take photographs. Aaron Yates of Kerrville Photo is a professional videographer. He's with us this morning and recording this forum, and it will be posted on the League's website within a couple of days, I'm thinking. So that if people say, I missed it, you can direct them to the League's website. I know we have some cards and information over there that'll give it to you, but if you Google LWV Hill Country, you'll find it. And I want to thank our League members who are here volunteering this morning. Bunny Bond's kind of our main greeter. Bonnie Powers is our treasurer who likes to take money. And we have greeters and question screeners, Dottie Brundrett, Julie Santel, Melinda Wasson, Rhonda Wiley-Jones, and it takes more than one person to get these together. As you know, we would like to have some questions after each of the speakers has finished. So if you didn't get a card to write a question on, hold up your hand and a League member will bring it to you. I hope, if you can, tell us which amendment. If you number it when you put down your question, that will be helpful. So this morning we have 4 esteemed members of our community who agreed to speak on the amendments. Mary Ellen Summerlin is the one who worked on finding people who were knowledgeable about these different areas, and we're going to give them each time to speak on the amendments, and then after that we'll take questions. Over here on my far left is Mr. David Wampler. He's a registered investment advisor with Maloney Securities Company here in Kerrville. He and his wife Melissa, an obstetrician gynecologist, have lived in Kerrville since 1994 and have raised their 2 children, Blake and Ava, through the public schools. David served 3 terms on the city council from 2000 to 2006 and as mayor from 2010 to 2012. And he will speak on numbers 1 and 6. Mr. Kenneth Early, is Senior Vice President at Texas Hill Country Bank. He and his wife, Kelly, who works for State Representative Andy Murr, have lived in Kerrville since 2008. Kenneth has shared his financial expertise in many nonprofit organizations in our community, from the Board of Habitat for Humanity, where he even taught classes in basic money management for prospective homeowners, to the Economic Improvement Corporation, where he is currently president. The Economic Improvement Corporation is the volunteer board appointed by the City Council to consider spending of the extra sales tax that Kerrville collects for economic development, and he will speak on numbers 2 and 7. The Honorable Susan Harris began serving as Kerr County Court at Law Judge in January of 2015. Members of the League will remember her from the candidate forum we sponsored for that election. She is a Kerrville native and mother of Sam, a graduate of Texas A&M, and Matthew, a graduate of Le Cordon Bleu Culinary School. She graduated from SMU Law School and practiced law with her mother and father, Laverne and Faye Harris. Susan was appointed to the bench in 1991, where she served as an associate judge for child support cases for 23 years. Judge Harris will speak on numbers 3 and 4. And Dr. Barry Shaw is Schreiner University professor and department chair of exercise science and sports management. The sports management major at Schreiner University is designed for individuals who wish to embark on one of the following career paths. 1, to pursue a career in sports administration, such as an athletic director at a high school. 2, go on to graduate studies and work on college university level. 3, work with professional sports teams and professional athletes. And 4, manage and direct sports facilities such as health clubs, sports arenas, ballparks, and stadia. Dr. Shaw is the longest serving member of the Schreiner faculty and has lived in our area for over 25 years. So now I'm going to ask, we're going to be casual this morning, and you can stay in your seat unless you feel comfortable standing up. If you would speak first on Amendment 1.
Okay,
Mr. Wampler.
thank you. Good morning, how are you all this morning? Thanks for being here. I will be speaking today on proposition numbers 1 and 6, which are both related to property tax abatements for certain classes of individuals in our state. Number 1 is a proposal that was passed by House Bill number 150 to be placed on the ballot in November, and it would provide a property tax exemption for partially disabled veterans with donated homes. Currently in the state, there are property tax exemptions in place for people that have received home. So if you're a partially disabled veteran and you've received a home full value as a donation by a nonprofit organization, there are laws in place that allow the property taxes to be fully abated too. So you've received a home for full value, you've paid nothing for it, and so going forward your property taxes are abated for as long as you're in that home. This amendment would clarify the situation for disabled veterans who've received a partial donation, 50% or so. There's a feeling, or they're trying to fix the situation where those property taxes are not abated for that individual, and that could provide or impose an undue burden on the disabled veterans. So this is an attempt, I think, to align a partial donation with the full donation from the standpoint of a property tax abatement. It was passed virtually unanimously both by the Senate and the House. It does not in and of itself, so if it passes in November, it does not in and of itself provide for the abatement, but it then authorizes our legislature to craft a bill that would provide the abatement at some point in the future.
Okay. Mr. Early, would you talk about number 2?
Sure. So proposition number 2 comes from the Senate Joint Resolution 60, which came out of the last legislative session. Let me give you a little bit of background on the homestead provision that our Constitution allows. That homestead provision was adopted in 1876. In 1997, voters agreed to amend the Constitution and allow borrowing against the equity in the home. They amended Article 16, Section 50 to get that done, and several changes to that and amendments have been done since 1997. This proposition is to change a couple of the provisions that are currently in place. And the second provision was done in 2004, which allowed you to have a line of credit against your equity in your home. And there were some provisions that were voted in there. The key to the overall home equity provisions that exist today is a limitation on how much you can borrow of the value in your home. Total. So if you have a first or a second lien, when you combine those, that limit is still 80%, which we're the only state that does that. Many other states loan as much as their bank will or financial institution will allow and how much risk those institutions want to take. We're the only state with a limitation like that. So that keeps us, in my opinion, healthy. So this legislature adopted these changes. They want to lower the fee cap. It's currently at 3%. So anyone making that loan has a limit of 3% of the amount of the loan that can total in fees. They want to lower that to 2%. And part of that and the offset is that they want to take away some of the fees associated with the 3% rule. Now it's all fees, and they're going to allow things such as title insurance, appraisals to be excluded from that fee. And currently many banks do not make home equity loans because they lose money. We have to have title insurance and we have to have the properties appraised to establish that value. Appraisals are more expensive today than they've ever been. There's been a lot of change in the appraisal laws, which require the appraisers to spend more time, and time is money. And so banks are eating those fees today and therefore don't offer an equity product because of that. So that's a good move for us to lower the fee to the consumer, plus allow other fees to be collected that banks currently are paying out of pocket. It also allows the home equity loans to be done on agriculture properties. Currently that's restricted. If you have an ag exemption on your property, you may not get an equity loan. And that hurts in a couple of ways. I've got a couple of examples. I have a customer that she wanted to go into business for herself. And what she had established working for someone else at retirement was a great retirement account and equity in her home. And the only thing she could borrow against was the equity in her home. She lives in Tierra Linda. Many of you probably know where that is. And every property in Tierra Linda has an ag exemption on it. Can't take it away. So she had no means to borrow the money on the equity in her home. She'd worked that hard. And so that will allow equity loans to be made on agricultural properties. They'll also allow a home equity loan to be turned into a non-equity loan, as long as you're in a first lien position, and there's some other provisions that have to occur in order for that to be the case. Currently, if it's an equity loan once, it's always an equity loan, and it would remove that provision. And then on the lines of credit that I spoke of that were allowed in 2004, they are currently limited to 50%. The line itself can be 50% of your value, and want to allow to go all the way to 80%. And 50% doesn't really help anything. I mean, you could loan up to 80% of the value in a combination of loans. So the 50% limit was established for a reason, but it, in my opinion, hasn't helped. So benefits for the consumer: it will lower the overall cost of credit. It will allow more financing flexibility. It'll allow more choices for low-cost financing. Home loans typically have a lower interest rate. Other types of loans, because of the added risk associated with it, have higher interest rates. It'll allow your tax deduction to continue on the interest, whereas if you were borrowing against something else, you would not get that tax deduction. It gives the agricultural homesteads identical rights to those that are non-agricultural, and then it gives the consumers a direction. One thing I didn't mention, it also establishes who can make home equity loans. And so it takes or it allows the most reputable institutions to make home equity loans. That's one change that's occurring in this proposition. There's a lot there. I completely understand that that's a lot of information about one single proposition. I'll answer any other questions that you might have I guess at a later time.
A little bit later. Judge Harris, Proposition 3.
Okay. And I thought your guide was excellent, so that's what I'm going to use. Proposition 3 is limiting service of office holders. The official ballot language is the constitutional amendment limiting the service of certain office holders appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate after the expiration of the person's term of office. The explanation for Proposition 3: it would modify the holdover provisions of all unsalaried officers appointed by the governor, such as appointees to volunteer boards and commissions. Current law, known as the holdover provision, allows all unsalaried appointees to continue to perform their duties of their office until a successor is duly qualified. Holdovers ensure continuation of functions, but have been used to serve as extensions of terms of office. This proposition makes it clear that if a term expires when the legislature is not in regular session, the officer will continue to serve only until the last day of the next regular session of the legislature. These unsalaried officials would not continue to serve in office past the expiration, even if no successor has been appointed. There would be a vacancy. If a new official is not appointed by the end of this session, then that office would remain vacant. There are your arguments for and against. The argument for it is it would limit the amount of time that a governor appointee can serve and would address concerns about some gubernatorial appointees being held over in their position long after their terms have expired. This would be a limit on how long an appointee could continue to serve in office and ensure that these unsalaried volunteer positions are rotated among qualified Texans. The argument against it is that the governor has thousands of appointed positions, and the existing law allows for flexibility for the appointees to continue serving until a qualified replacement has been found. The amendment could result in many appointed positions remaining vacant if a qualified replacement is not found within a certain time frame.
And would you go on to Proposition 4 then?
Number 4. Proposition 4 is challenge to the Constitution. The official ballot language is the constitutional amendment authorizing the legislature to require a court to provide notice to the Attorney General of a challenge to the constitutionality of a state statute and authorizing the legislature to prescribe a waiting period before the court may enter a judgment holding the statute unconstitutional. The explanation for Proposition 4 would require a court to notify the state attorney general when a party to litigation files a petition, a motion, or other pleading challenging the constitution of a state statute. The court must wait 45 days after providing the notice before entering a judgment holding the statute unconstitutional. In 2011, the state legislature passed a statute with a similar notice and waiting period, but in 2013, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, that's our highest criminal court in the state, ruled that the law was unconstitutional. Proposition 4 is designed to provide a constitutional basis for the notice and the waiting period and to restore the 2013 law back into effect. The arguments for it: Proposition 4 ensures that the state has an opportunity to defend the constitutionality of its laws. The proposed amendment would not alter the state's separation of powers doctrine, nor restrict the ability of courts to strike down laws as unconstitutional. This amendment would only provide the Attorney General with notice so the Attorney General could offer assistance to defend a state law. It would not challenge the authority of the Attorney General's office over criminal matters, because in our criminal cases we have a prosecutor, which is a state attorney already involved in the case. The arguments against it: the Constitution should not be amended in any way that would undermine the state's separation of powers doctrine. Each branch of the government should be able to exercise its powers without interference from another branch. The legislature should not establish procedures that delay a Texan's right to pursue and receive relief from unconstitutional laws. Under current law in criminal cases, the state prosecuting attorney, not the Attorney General, represents the state. This law could create confusion regarding the Attorney General's role in criminal cases.
Thank you. And Dr. Shaw.
Well, I was asked to talk about the Charitable Sports Foundation proposal, and I need to kind of give you a little background. I talked about this in my athletics administration class on Wednesday. We had this conversation. I said, okay, you're prospective athletics administrators, what do you think of this? And you're all voters. And so we talked about some of the pros and cons. And I'll kind of lead this the way I led them. I said, in 2016, we, Texas, approved legislation that said that professional sports teams in Major League Baseball, the NBA, National Basketball Association, but NFL, the big time professional sports, if they had a charitable foundation, the charitable foundation could have raffles. And those raffles could pay cash to winners and all of that, but the charitable foundation had to funnel that money into their charitable work, whatever it was. And I said, what do you think of that? And so we talked about that, and I said, so now the next question is, what is being proposed now is to expand that to include minor league sports, to include sports like NASCAR up around Dallas-Fort Worth, Formula One in Austin, but it would include things like Sugar Land Skeeters baseball team, or the San Antonio Missions, or the San Antonio Rampage. And so it would allow those organizations that have charitable trusts or charitable foundations set up to be able to engage in this raffle process. And I said, so given that, what do you think are some of the good things about it? What are some of the not so good things about it? And so they came up with things such as, well, it would allow more money to go back into the community, which is terrific because theoretically all of these foundations have mission statements that are intended by premise to support the local communities. And so example, the Houston Astros would be a pretty good example. Houston Astros do a 50-50 raffle at every home game. Have any of you ever been to an Astros game? They do this 50-50 raffle, and 50% goes to the winner of the raffle, 50% goes to the charitable foundation. Well, the foundation is intended, their mission is to provide, and I'm paraphrasing, educational and recreational experiences for disadvantaged and underserved constituents, children in the city of Houston in baseball and softball and those kinds of activities. Well, this year, unfortunately, Houston was hit with some other issues that the charitable foundation was able to jump in and do some things to help kids kind of rebound from some of the flooding that occurred and some of the The point is, they made a ton of money. So I'm talking to my students about it, and they said, well, that's great, but it's gambling. And I said, but we approved it in 2016, so what's the difference between expanding that and maybe, they said, well, it's gambling. And so I guess where it left me was that in the discussion, I think that it's not whether we expand, it's whether we limit. And the proposed legislation right now would apply the same basic kinds of safeguards that are already in place. And so it would mandate any other entity that wanted to start this raffle process to be basically under the same kinds of legislative requirements as any other professional sports team that's already doing it. And one thing I could probably point out to many of you is that many of you probably don't know, but the San Antonio Spurs Sports and Entertainment also owns the San Antonio Stars currently. They're about to move. They own the San Antonio Rampage, and they own the San Antonio Football Club, which is not a Major League Soccer program. It's a National American Soccer League program. And so this would allow those other three components to be able to do what the Spurs are already doing. And so this legislation really is an expansion of what was approved by us as voters in 2016, and the same kinds of safeguards and kinds of regulatory mechanisms would be in place. So there you go.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to number 6, Mr. Wampler.
Again, my second proposition is number 6, that is also related to a property tax exemption for certain classes of individuals in our state. By way of background, Section 1, Article 8 of the Texas Constitution requires that houses be taxed in proportion to their values unless the Constitution exempts this requirement for specific types of properties or persons. Proposition 6 would allow the legislature to create an exemption from this requirement that houses be taxed in proportion to their value. It would not be the first amendment to allow this type of an exemption. In 2011, voters passed Proposition 1, which allowed the legislature to provide a property tax exemption to surviving spouses of totally disabled veterans. So Proposition 6, that will be on our November ballot, it seeks to extend property tax exemption to the surviving spouses of disabled or killed first responders, and it would also provide clarification language with regard to what constitutes a first responder. So Proposition 6 just expands an exemption that's already on the books for disabled and deceased veterans and moves on to the first responders, which I'm sure would include fire, EMS, police, and so forth. The one thing that again, it was virtually unopposed in both houses of the Senate and the House of Representatives, and was moved forward to go onto the ballot in November. The one thing I do see is that under this rule, should a spouse become remarried, then they lose their exemption. So it would only be for a spouse, male or female, that is unmarried and living in a home after their spouse has been disabled or killed. In this case, if they remarried, they would lose their exemption. So again, pretty straightforward. Both 1 and 6 are just creating classes of people in our state that would receive some relief from their residential property taxes.
Thank you. And last one, number 7.
Number 7, Proposition 7 would amend Article 3, Section 47 of the Texas Constitution and allow the legislator to permit credit unions and other financial institutions to conduct promotional activities to encourage savings. So they're going to allow, this proposition would allow financial institutions to have a raffle, and you would basically get your name in the drawing, so to speak, by opening a savings account. It requires you can at any time take the money out of the savings account. It's not an expense. And so this amendment, so to speak, was tried and passed in the 84th legislature in 2015 with House Bill 1628, and the governor vetoed the bill, citing that it would violate Article 3, Section 47. So they're back again, asking for the amendment to the Constitution that was cited in the governor's veto of this before. Supporters say that it would promote savings. They give some statistics that 1/3 of the Texas households lack a savings account, and about half don't have a 3-month emergency fund. So the promotion of the raffle, the promotion that the raffle would bring would encourage savings. Opponents say that it's not necessary, that it does not violate Article 3, Section 47. So it's not necessary to have an amendment. Others say that it would allow just one single industry in our state. It'd be a carve-out, allowing the banking or financial industry to have a raffle if this passes. So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to our speakers. Audience members, have you written down any questions you'd like to have entertained? We have a few questions. This is, I guess, a bit of a comment. Propositions are so vague that voting for amounts to a blank check. Would you agree that that could happen in, say, with the tax exemptions?
I wouldn't necessarily agree it amounts to a blank check. I would agree that propositions generally are fairly hard to understand if you've not done your research prior to go to the polling place. So if you're sitting down for the first time and reading the description, there are actually ratings that you can find with regard to the clarity and how the propositions are worded, and their readability score, so to speak, so that someone that is unaware of what the proposition might entail would reasonably be able to understand its implications. With regard to tax abatements or tax relief specifically, I wouldn't say that it's a blank check, but I would say that one of the criticisms of it generally is that rather than seeking to increase a fairness across the board for all taxpayers, these sorts of exemptions carve out certain groups of people, no matter how deserving they may be, but definitely carves them out of the tax system so that they're not contributing their share to the overall budget of the state. So I wouldn't say that it's a blank check. I would say to a certain extent it diminishes the budget by carving out. Question going forward would be, when does it stop? How many groups are there out there that may have representation in the legislature that feel they should receive tax exempt status on their homesteads? And that, that's a good question going forward.
Do you have any feelings on that as to having specific groups be exemptions so that the remainder of the taxpayers have a greater burden?
I guess as a taxpayer, if you can separate your feelings for the people that are being affected, whether first responders or disabled veterans, which we owe a lot of gratitude and thanks for all their sacrifice. If you can separate that for a second with regard to everybody paying their fair share, I guess I would say that it's not entirely fair, and it probably puts to a certain extent an undue burden on the state's finances. Neither one of these bills seeks to quantify the amount of relief in terms of tax revenue that the state would be giving up, and I have no idea what that would be. But again, if certain classes of people continually carved out in every legislative session, it would be interesting to see what happens to our overall tax base. I wouldn't think that it'd be particularly good if the phenomenon occurs over and over again.
Thank you. Mr. Early, on the housing, the home equity loans, why would anyone want to convert their home equity loan to a non-HEL and risk losing consumer protection that's provided by the HEL?
You can only have one home equity loan at a time. And so if you convert your first lien into a non-equity loan, then it's no longer an equity loan. And later on, if you needed that ability to borrow against it again, you can get another equity loan.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about the state executive term limits. And looks like there's about 3,000 positions that are appointed by the governor, and about 1/3 of them are open every legislative session. 1,000, about 1,000 are open every session. Do you have any idea what the problem is that causes that?
I personally do not. This is what, according to the governor's office, members of most boards and commissions serve 6 years, staggered terms, with 1/3 of the terms expiring every 2 years, and most terms expiring in the odd number years. The appointment process for most boards and most commissions requires Senate confirmation of the nominee, and the Senate may consider confirmations during their regular or special sessions. So some of this could be, maybe it's not a priority for them, or that it is, in fact, if you have somebody that's still holding over, then the business is being tended to, so we don't need to get to it.
Here's another both comment and a little bit of a question, hoping that perhaps this amendment would bring to light that any resident or voter in the state can apply to serve on these boards and commissions. And if you go to the governor's website, you can find the application there. And do you know of anybody, or have you yourself applied to serve on any of these?
I have not, but there are so many excellent boards, commissions that could use qualified volunteers, and there are many Texans that would be, it would be a real service for them if they would like to step up and take on some of those open positions and serve on some of the boards.
There's like building and trade, there's dental, there's social work. So if anybody wants to think about volunteering, I believe they provide travel reimbursement.
Yes.
And oftentimes there is a stipend for attending a meeting.
Yes.
I want to go, questions? Thank you. This is on number 7. Unless there is a minimum term, the savings must stay in the account, such as 1 year, to prevent a person from getting a prize and then withdrawing it. Do you think it's really going to do any good? Will it?
Well, it certainly is better than doing nothing. I mean, the statistics are correct on the average household's savings. So maybe it will, maybe it won't. But again, if they get started, I know this from my habitat training, we require each of the families to save X number of dollars before they're actually given the house. And part of the training I give to the habitat families is, how do you do that? Many families don't budget at all. So any effort to help someone establish a savings, I think, would help.
Okay. Let's go to, I thought I had it. Number 5. What's to prevent anyone from establishing a sport entity in order to take advantage of the raffles?
Based on what I understand from the proposed legislation, it would have to be part of a commissioned semi-professional league and/or some subsidiary kind of league. So it would have to be For instance, the NHL owns the American Hockey League, American Hockey Association, and a couple of other minor league teams. In Major League Baseball, it'd have to be a AAA, AA, single A affiliate of one of the major league teams. That's my
Okay.
understanding. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but that's the way I
Okay.
understand it.
And this is back to number 2. Are the details embodied in the amendment, or will the amendment allow the legislature to expand home equity loans?
I don't know the answer to the question, is it embodied in the amendment? I have, from the House Research Organization, all the details associated with proposition number 2, and it's still very restrictive. One of the most restrictive home equity provisions, so to speak, in the union, I guess the only one. So there's still a lot of qualifiers for every single piece that is being changed this time. The key to this whole provision, I think, and why the state of Texas did so well in this last housing bubble is the 80% rule. The more equity you have in your home and limiting your ability to borrow above that 80% helps you deal with the cyclicalness of real estate. And so our state fared very well in the last downturn. I don't know how many of you have watched The Big Short, the movie. It's hard to understand, but for those of us in the industry, very interesting what was going on in other states. We would have never allowed that in the state of Texas.
Okay, thank you.
And one other thing, you
Sure.
had asked the question earlier about why someone would want to change from an equity loan to a non-equity loan. There's a cost associated with an equity loan. Equity loans have a bit more risk in them for the financial institution, so the rates are higher. So if you took away the equity provisions, the rate will go down.
Okay, thank you. And this is another one also on that proposition 2. Fee cap seems to help banks increase their profit. What are the advantages, if any, to borrowers, and what are the potential disadvantages?
So under the 3% cap rule, which we're under today, these fees are included. Appraisals by third-party appraisers, surveys for properties by licensed surveyors, premiums established by the state for title insurance, and title examination reports. Those are the ones being excluded in the 2% rule. And again, in some cases, your equity loan has to be so large with those included in the 3% rule in order for you to capture enough fee to pay those costs. Third-party appraisals, there's no benefit to the financial institution other than getting a properly established value. We have no monetary benefit in that. Surveys, we certainly have no monetary benefit in that. Title insurance, they're all third-party fees. So I think the 2% piece probably doesn't change much the fee structure for the bank itself. You know, if they had moved it up, yes, definitely, I think that would be the case, but they moved it down.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Proposition 4. This law seems to be a violation of the separation of powers, with the legislature dictating to the courts a time frame as to when a decision can be rendered on a case related to a part of the state constitution. What do you think?
And that was why the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals struck it down when it was a statute. It was originally in our government code, and it required the courts to give notice to the Attorney General and could not make any kind of a ruling for 45 days. The Court of Appeals, in their 2013 case, said that it violates the separation of powers in the Texas Constitution. And the provision states that the powers of the state of the government are divided into three distinct branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches, and that no branch shall exercise any power properly attached to either of the others, except in the instances expressly permitted by the Constitution. So, arguably, if the people, through the amendment, want the courts to give notice to the Attorney General's office and delay a decision for 45 days after notice has been given, then that's what the people of the state of Texas want.
Okay. And would this law pertain to every level of court in the state, including JP?
That's my understanding is, and that's, again, with what we have in front of us on the proposition
Right.
is, yes, it would be any time, as I understand, a pleading, motion, petition, anything challenging the constitutionality of one of our laws. So yes, I think you could have filed that in any of our courts, and it would trigger a notice to the Attorney General.
And do you think it would affect federal courts that are located in the state?
Good question. The federal, as I understand it, Proposition 4, and I have to, for just a minute, thank Kelly Early, Kenneth's wife, who sent some great information. Your guide is excellent. Kelly, in Representative Andy Murr's office, also has a little bit more information on each of these, and so I need to credit her with this information. Proposition 4 would be in line with a similar rule relating to federal law and would not deny anyone relief in the state court. So it would essentially be following some federal law as well.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Shaw, you talked a little bit about gambling. It seems like the legislature may be expanding gambling. Do you have any idea why only sports foundations are kind of part of beginning the trend?
Honestly, I would speculate, this is just my guess, because they have a pretty high attendance rate, interest. I talk about this in class. People are pretty crazy about sports. Like, how many of you have a favorite sports team?
Okay.
Some people would say, oh, I love, and they've never lived in the city. You know, I have students that wear Yankees stuff and they've never lived outside of Kerrville, Texas. But they think the Yankees are cool. And so I would probably speculate that there's some of that. I really don't know.
Okay. And do you know anything about who's going to monitor the raffles? Was there anything in here that granted the Secretary of State's office or the Lottery Commission funds to monitor?
That I don't know.
Okay. Okay. Other questions from the audience? I'm trying to watch our time a little bit too.
I do have one.
Yeah.
About the.
Would you write it down real quickly? I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get you a card. And I'll ask another.
I've got it right.
Mr. Early, you talked about this a little bit, especially working with the Habitat folks. Some people argue that this amendment would encourage people to save and cut into the payday loan business. Do you feel like it could do that?
Well, that is.
This is for number 7, sorry.
The payday loan business is definitely part of every single family that we train in Habitat. You'll look at we pull their credit, of course, and you'll look at where they're borrowing money. And a lot of times they are paying an exorbitant amount of interest. If they can get off of that roller coaster and that cycle, I don't know if many of you understand how that really works, but you borrow $100 and you're going to pay it back at your next payday. and you walk in and they say, oh, just pay us $25 and you don't have to pay us the 100 back. We'll let it roll for another payday cycle. And if you calculated a full year at that $100 of $25 a month, which is the minimum fee, the interest rate is in the thousands. And people don't realize that. So if they can ever get that money put back to where they have those emergency funds and get started on that, yes, I think it will cut into the payday lending program.
Just as a matter of information to the audience, the League of Women Voters has done a study on payday lending and has worked some in the legislative sessions to try to curb some of that, because the fees are very exorbitant, as you were saying, and people are encouraged to reborrow. And so what may start out as something small may end up being triple or more that they pay back. We do have one entity here in Kerrville called Freedom Loans that tries to help people to convert, because there are oftentimes that people do need money on an emergency basis just to keep their utilities turned on and things like that. So if anybody wants information about that, contact the League and we can steer you toward Freedom Loans. This is on amendment number 6. Mr. Wampler, is there a limit on the value of the surviving spouse's home that would be exempt?
I don't see that there's a limit, but there is one stipulation that should the surviving spouse move to a new home, then the amount of the exemption is capped at the amount that was provided on the original home. So if you are living in a house, say at $200,000, and you have a $7,000 or $8,000 exemption, and you move to a more expensive home down the road, assuming you remain unmarried, your exemption on the new, more valuable home would be capped at what you were originally exempted on the less expensive home. But I don't see in any of the information I've read that there's a cap on the actual amount or the value of the home.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if we have any other burning. We've talked some about those exemptions, and it's kind of up to how you feel as to whether you provide exemptions for certain groups, because it does cause a burden on other taxpayers. But as you said, the groups that have been named are groups that provide a lot of services to our country and to our community, veterans and first responders. The home equity loan, I'm going to ask one more question. Do you think that this would lead to more foreclosures, possibly, this new proposition?
I don't see that. I just don't.
Okay.
I don't think it will. It's so restrictive. It's hard to get a home equity loan if any of you have ever tried. And so those restrictions are there and in place on purpose, and it protects the consumer. So
Okay.
I just don't see it having a long-term effect on people abusing that, which would cause the foreclosures.
I'm going to ask a question about number 4, and I want to thank once again our volunteers this morning. We're not trying to put them on the spot. We're just calling on their expertise in their area to help us understand a little bit more. Why was the law not written to require a plaintiff to inform the Office of the Attorney General that the case would have an impact on the Texas Constitution when the case was filed? And I know you're not part of writing the law, but you may have some ideas on that.
I don't know. I guess because once it has been filed, then you have in front of the court a requirement that the court has to notify the Attorney General's office. And then you have in that file a notice that's been sent, and if the appropriate notice hasn't been sent, the court can't make a ruling. But if the court has sent the notice properly and waited the amount of time, then they can go forward with the case. I think it would be a way to track the notice clearly in the court's file, perhaps.
Okay. Do you see this as creating a greater backlog on court cases?
I don't. Again, using some of Kelly's information, the Attorney General's current system for receiving notices of unconstitutional statutes and deciding how to respond to challenges to Texas works well with the office receiving, this would be the Attorney General's office, receiving about 60 to 90 notices annually from 2014 to 2016. That's not a lot. And our system of justice has time frames set up anyway, certain amounts of time that we have to wait to give someone notice, to allow someone to respond, to get a court setting. So I don't see it as unreasonably long.
Okay.
I don't.
Panelists, have you thought of anything you would like to add, comment on? Okay. I just once again want to thank you for taking the time to do this, to research and to spend here with us this morning. I mentioned the voting guide before, and I would like to encourage anyone that wants to join the League of Women Voters, men and women both. And you only have to be over the age of 16. Our funds are our dues are $60 a year, and for an individual, $85 for a household, $30 for a student, and they're prorated through the months. If you're interested, stop by the table over here. Also, our league's primary fundraiser is Belt Charity Day tickets, and we choose to use this because it's an easier way to raise money than having dinners and things like that. But as you can guess, there is some cost in having forums, rental of rooms, providing flyers and written information, those kinds of things. So if you would like to shop, get you a $5 ticket, and then when you shop on the Charity Day event, that you save $5 at your purchase. I want to thank everybody that's here this morning for supporting the league and coming out, and I hope that you found that this was helpful, and we'll keep watching for information in the community. Next spring we have a lot of elections coming up, and we hope to provide information to you. And so if you would give our panelists a round of applause, that will be it. Thank you. Sure. Have a good day.